Yeah, they brought in my accordion in that great big box, and someone asked me what it was. I said, that's my sermon notes. Hope you're ready for a long one. But it's really not. Despite their fear, that's the title today. Can you take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 5 to begin with? I guess I can't do both of those at the same time. Okay. Genesis chapter 5 is a chapter that very clearly helps us date how old our earth is. And all you need to do is be good at math. All you need to do is be good at adding. You don't even have to know how to multiply or divide or do those other weird things, trigonometry. But if you can add, you can figure out how old the earth is with Genesis chapter 5 and chapter 11. Let me show you how you do that. Let's start reading Genesis chapter 5. Let's start at verse 3. When Adam lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. That's amazing to me. I mean, God created the first woman. No sin, no disease. No, I mean, she was a 10 out of 10, okay? And when he's 130 years, he has his first kid. Nothing else needs to be said there. Okay, he's 130 and he has his first boy. Now, after Seth was born, he lived 800 more years and had other sons and other daughters. Altogether, he lived 930 years, and then he dies. The rest of that doesn't help us date the world. But the fact that when he had his first son, he was 130, means that from Adam to the first generation was 130 years. Now, let's see what happened to Seth. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. So now, 130 and 105, 235 years, that's ready for the third generation. Are you following me? Now, we're not going to do all the math all the way through, but I'll tell you, if you go right to the end of chapter 5 and add them all up, from Adam to the flood was 1,656 years. All you got to do is add it. So from Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. Now, if you go over to Genesis chapter 11, it picks up exactly the same place and says, from the flood, Noah lived so long, and then he had a child, and then he lived so long, and he had a child, and he lived so long. It goes all the way up to Abraham in chapter 11. And then you have to jump all the way through to chapter 21 before you find out that Abraham was 100 years old when he had Isaac. It wasn't his first child, but it was the child that from there on we can trace the biblical genealogy pretty easy because we're given a lot more details. Like many of these people, the only detail we're given is that he was born this guy's son, and when he was this old, he had another son, and this was his name. But you can add that all together. When you do that, you discover that the entire length from Christ backwards is about 4,500 years, approximately. So I want to give you, now, during that time, we have all of the Old Testament history, and I just want to show you where we're landing today in this book of Ezra. I'm going to be going through a series in Ezra. Now, I can promise you that when I get a chance to speak on Resurrection Sunday, I've got something exciting that I'm not going to be talking about the Old Testament on that particular Sunday. But generally, I'm going to be going through the book of Ezra if you're willing to keep inviting me back. So, if we put, because we've got about 4,500 years on that side, and we've got 2,026 years on this side of Christ. So let's put Christ right here in the middle of this thing. So Christ died 33 years, or Christ was born, 33 years later he died. 2,000 years after that is going to be 2033. big date for Christianity. There are going to be celebrations in every church. I'm sure that you're going to be part of it because it's going to be the 2000th anniversary of the resurrection. I would love to preach on that Easter Sunday. So now let's go back. Let's go back another 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. About where some of you parked your car, that was the beginning of the world. Okay? And most of that we have a history. We've got very little. We've got the creation, we've got the fall, we've got people turning evil, Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood. And so the flood happens right around, let me get the date better for you. The flood happens about 1650 years after Adam, so 3,000 years before Christ. You have the flood. And then you have the beginning of the nation of Israel. And so Isaac was born about 2,000 years before Christ. So you've got Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, taking people into Egypt because he was sold as a slave, got to Egypt, became the second in command, invited his family back. By the way, he brought 75 or maybe 76 people with him to live with him, and that was his family's house, 75. And then a few generations passed, and it says a new king arrived, didn't know anything about Joseph, but now this 75 is growing to about 2 million. That's pretty good birth rate. So that's the beginning of Israel through to the time when Jacob and Joseph, and they had their children and they multiplied and eventually they ended up, Moses led the people out of this slavery that they got into in Egypt. He ends up taking them into the promised land. We have the period when God ruled through judges. He said, I don't want my nation to be the same. So I am the leader, I am the king, period. But eventually they said, we'd really like to have a king like everyone else, like all the other nations. Like, we have a tendency to do that. I sure like to do what everyone else is doing. And God says, you're going to be sorry. But he gave him a king. So then we started the kingdom of Israel. Now that's 1,500 years before Jesus. So we're going to put, if this is Christ, there's 1,000, there's 2,000. So right about here, we have a kingdom. So we got a throne for the kingdom. Started with Saul, probably a pretty big kingdom because he stood head and shoulders above everyone else, which is kind of interesting. This whole thing about David and Goliath, David being a young shepherd boy, and Goliath being 1.5 feet to maybe 20 inches taller than everyone else. Who is the obvious person to fight Goliath? Just saying. So, and for 40 years, Saul reigned, and then for 40 years, David reigned, and for 40 years, his son Rehoboam reigned. And Solomon reigned. And at the end of Solomon's death, Rehoboam was going to take over the kingdom, and he was going to add more taxes, and so Jeroboam came to him and said, don't do that. The nation split in two, and so at this point, we're now 930 years before Christ, because there was from 1050 to 930 is 120 years, 40 years each. Now we have two kingdoms. We have the kingdom in the south, and we have a kingdom in the north. So now there's two thrones. And they split up. There's a big difference because the kingdom in the south, they still followed the Mosaic law and they still followed the line of David. And so the Bible follows their story more because they were the nation that continued to follow the religion of Moses. In the north, they had a problem. Number one, Jerusalem was in the southern kingdom. It's really foolish to break away from a nation and then send everyone in your nation back for their big celebration every year, 3 times, in fact, if they went to all 3 of them, back to the nation, to the enemy's territory. So Jeroboam, he came up with, well, we got to do something. So let's make our own places of worship. And so they made 2 golden calves. They put one as close as they could to the border of the southern kingdom, as close as they could to Jerusalem, because then the people that was closer to go to Jerusalem than it was to go up at the other end, well, here's one place that's even closer. It was called Bethel. And the other one they put at the far north, place called Dan. So they tried to make sure, Jeroboam tried to make sure, okay, now there's a place of worship. And so he made 2 golden calves, and they said this: these are the gods that brought you out of Egypt. And the people followed him. Like, I think, not that I'm trying to give them wise advice and wish he had done different, because that was God's yard, but I think at least he would have said, okay, we're no longer following that God. Now our new gods are going to look at, but he didn't even say that. He says, these are the gods that did all the things that every one of you know God did. And they started following these other idols. Well, they didn't hold true to the Mosaic laws. They didn't hold true to the line of David, and they had to get their own priests, because the true priests of Aaron, as soon as the nation split, now they didn't have a territory of their own, remember, they lived among the people in all the other 11 tribes. They said, we want to be associated with our religion. So they moved back down to the southern kingdom so they could continue on with the Mosaic laws and the Mosaic religion. So that means Jeroboam's left up in the north kingdom, and I don't know who I'm going to get. So I said, we've got these jobs. The job is called minister, pastor, preacher. Anyone wants the job? Come and get it. We'll give it to anyone. Qualifications? You show up. If you show up, you got the job. I always think it's kind of funny when people say, I was praying, God, I want to know what you want me to do with my life, and I applied to Bible school, and they accepted me. They've never not accepted everybody. Of course they accept everyone. They need students. Well, that was it. If you show up, you get the job. You're the pastor. Because of that, they were even more corrupt than the southern kingdom, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they only lived until 722 years before Christ. So someplace, if that's 930, so someplace right around here, their kingdom collapsed. And what happened to their kingdom, the world power at the time, was the nation of Assyria. And when Assyria overthrew a nation, what they did is they took the people and they split them up into a whole bunch of different small groups, and then they would make these people live with those people, and those people live with these people. And basically what they were trying to do is, we got to have a mixed company because we don't want any single nation to gather a big army. So let's just give them a whole bunch of little nations. So their throne fell. I'll try not to fall on it. Their throne fell. That's about 722 years before Christ. The southern kingdom lasted another 130 years. Corrupt most of the time, had some God-fearing kings, but eventually they as well turned away against God. Now, when Assyria was in power, the northern kingdom was destroyed. Then Babylon became the next world power, overthrew Assyria. And so when God was going to bring judgment upon the southern kingdom, he used the nation of Babylon. And you all heard about the Babylonian exile. Well, that started 122 years, 586 is when they finally took everyone out. 606 before Christ is when Babylon took their first prisoners and took their first prisoners out. So now just a little bit this side, 130 years, 136 to be exact, now the southern kingdom falls. Now, there is no kingdom. The northern kingdom is kind of scattered among all the nations. The southern kingdom, Babylon had a different idea. Their idea was, we're going to take the nations away from where they used to live, and we're going to colonize them. So there's these colonies of here's one nation and here's another nation. One of those colonies was the colony of the Jews, the Hebrews. And they split up the nations instead of trying to intermingle them. Now, the important thing is that meant that the northern kingdom, when they're mixed up with all the people, and still the boys notice the pretty girls. And they get married, and so their children are mixed breed. But the colonization, they have no choice. They're kind of like the Hutterites of today. Where are you going to find a bride? Well, you have two choices. Our Hutterite colony or the one down there. You got to pick your bride amongst one of those two. And so their nation ended up staying pretty pure. That becomes important when we land at where we're going to land today. So from 500 years before Christ, then we start this Babylonian captivity. It only lasts for 70 years. And at the end of it, another world power overthrew Babylon. That was the nation of Persia. Or Persia overthrows Babylon, and this new king comes to power. His name is Cyrus, and God has actually given some prophecies about him way back in Isaiah's time, way back about here. And so he ends up making this declaration, and we looked at it when I was here a couple times ago. And we find that Ezra, the story of Ezra, is actually part 3 of a 4-part story. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are the stories of the kings, the chronicles of the kings. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then Ezra picks up. Remember, we looked at Ezra. The first 2 verses of Ezra are identical to the last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles, if you were here then. They're exactly the same verse, probably written by the same author as well. And so then we have Ezra and his history, and then we have the story of Nehemiah. Now, Ezra is named Ezra because he's one of the primary people in the story. He's probably not the author, and he only shows up halfway through. The beginning of Ezra is all about this guy named Zerubbabel, because Zerubbabel gets the permission from Cyrus when he makes this decree. Anyone wants to go and rebuild the altar and rebuild the temple, he can go back. In fact, we'll give him money to help him rebuild. And so he goes back and he starts to rebuild the temple. And then Nehemiah, then we have the story of Ezra. Ezra is the one, after they had rebuilt the altar, Ezra comes and he's the one who says, hey, you guys, if we want God's blessing, we've got to live by God's rules. So he was the one who demands some reform. And then the latter part of Ezra is about him demanding God's people to be godly. And then this guy named Nehemiah, he's a short guy, Nehemiah, he shows up. You guys missed all that. Okay, anyway, this short guy, he shows up, and he's the guy who rebuilds the entire wall around Jerusalem in only 52 days. And how he did that is just an excellent example of leadership. So today we're talking about this Ezra. Cyrus has made it, the southern kingdom has been destroyed, and now 70 years have gone by. Now Babylon Empire is overthrown by Persia. Cyrus, the new king, says anyone who wants can go back and build an altar. So Ezra starts to tell this story of them going back and building an altar. And that's what we read in this particular story. Let me just click on this and then you can see it behind me, I believe. I know, I want to tell you, that was a long introduction. But the conclusion won't be so long. And a good sermon is a good introduction and a good conclusion, as close together as possible. So we're going to work on that. Here's what it says. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, so they get this decree, you can go back and you can rebuild the altar and the temple. They go back to Jerusalem. They go back and they live in their own hometowns, all the little small places. Some of them lived in Drayton Valley. Some of them lived in Edson. And the people who like fast cars, they lived in Edmonton. And so they each go back to their own hometown. They assembled in their own hometown. But then they gather as one man in Edmonton, in the main, Jerusalem. They all get together as one man. I'm going to come back to that. They gathered together as one man. They've been sent to do a job, rebuild the altar and the temple. They're going to build the altar first, but they're going to do it as one man. That's not a coincidence. That's a choice. Then Jeshua, son of Joe, fellow priest with Zerub, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, I shorten them because I can't pronounce them, began to build the altar of God in Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. The first thing they built was the altar. They didn't start with laying the foundation of the temple. They didn't start with the walls around the temple or the walls of the temple. The first thing they built was the altar. Why? Because as quickly as possible, they wanted to start honoring God with their sacrifices. We don't really need the edifice. We don't need the temple. We don't need that brazen altar, and we don't need the golden lampstands, and we'll get to them. But what we really need is the place of sacrifice. So they worked together as one man. They started on the altar. And then it says, when I preached this the first time, I actually read, I went from chapter 1, and when I go through, I always just follow through a book. And if you read chapter 2, it tells you all the people that came back in groups of 500, 800, 900, sometimes 1,000, 42,360 of them. Roberta says, are you going to read all 4,000 of them? And I said, no, we'll just jump to chapter 3 and I'll just tell everyone there's 42,000 people showed up, 42,360. And they all assembled in their own homes. And then, despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it, both morning and evening. The first thing they did was build. Now, the reason it says despite their fear is because what had happened is when they came in to rebuild, so this is the southern kingdom now is given permission after their fall, after the 70 years captivity, after Cyrus becomes the new world power, he says you can go back and rebuild it. They go back and they're rebuilding the altar. But the northern kingdom, the nation that had mixed with all the other nations, they come and they say, we want to help you. This is an altar to our God. We're from Jerusalem too. We're Israelites too. And so we want to help you build. And they said, no, you're no longer Israelites. You're a whole bunch of, let me just use the word that describes it best. Please don't take offense. Half-breeds. You're a bunch of people who are mixed up. You're not true Jews anymore. We do not want your help. You broke away from us right after Solomon. God punished you 136 years before us. Not sure that that's a good argument, but I'm sure they mentioned it. And now God's given us the privilege of coming back, not you. You're not part of us. And so they became the enemy. And they were doing everything they can. First of all, just psychologically, but then eventually with weapons. They were building with a sword in one hand and a brick in the other. And all the peoples around them, from the northern kingdom originally, were now their enemy. And they're trying to rebuild this altar, but they're terrified of the people that are now and mad at them because they wouldn't allow them to build the altar with them. Does not say they overcame their fear and continued to build. Doesn't say that, does it? How often are we told as Christians, perfect love casts out all fear? So if you're afraid of something, then obviously it's your fault, because if you had perfect love, you wouldn't be afraid of anything. Right? Lots of different things that people are afraid of. Lots of different things that people are. I've got a list of just a couple. I got to go back a couple here. Let me tell you some of the things that people are afraid of. If you have acrophobia, you're afraid of heights. Anyone here afraid of heights? I just don't like to. had some fun experiences with people that were afraid of heights. One of them was Pastor Larry. We were putting a roof on our church, and he's terrified of heights. But he's also so embarrassed because we're putting the shingles on his church, and he's not upstairs helping. And finally I said, well, if you want to come up, I'll hold the ladder for you. And so he got brave enough to come up, in spite of the fact that his youth pastor was holding the ladder. That was dumb. Now, you can tell if someone's scared when they're climbing the ladder, because if they're not scared, their hands and their legs are out where they're kind of convenient, and they can climb comfortably. But when they're scared, their ladder's right here, and they have to move their nose around every rung, and their knees are going out sideways because they're so close, because they're getting as close to that. You know what I'm talking about? So he's not looking up. He's just getting, but he's slowly moving one. And as he's coming up, I'm holding the ladder. Very, very slowly, so he doesn't perceive what I'm doing. I'm slowly moving the ladder off the building. So when he gets up, so he's eye level with the top of the roof, the eaves trough, he's this far away. I want to tell you that although he was afraid of heights, he can go down a ladder more faster than you can believe. He had acrophobia. Hydrophobia, anyone want to guess that? That is fear of water. Hydrophobia, fear of water. Globophobia is fear of balloons, or fear of balloons popping. Either one is called globophobia. Now here's one, I got to work on how do you pronounce this one. Erythrotrophobia. That's the fear of peanut butter sticking to the roof of your mouth. True. You know what phobophobia is? Phobophobia is fear of fear. And I'm afraid that there's a number of people that they're in there. They're just afraid about being afraid. And I mean, that's kind of a bad circle to get into. Here's a fairly new one in our culture. Nomophobia is the fear of losing or being without your smartphone. How can I live without my smartphone? I remember the first time I ever saw a lady in a grocery store, and she had what they called at that time a mobile phone, but remember they were this big and had an antenna, and when she gets to the grocery store, she's at the till, and she's talking to someone on this phone. I thought, good grief, someday we're all going to carry those stupid things. And I was right. I just didn't know they'd get smaller and easier to carry, but we're all carrying those. Here's what the Jewish people from the southern kingdom had. They had androphobia. Androphobia is the fear of men. They were afraid of the people around them. They literally were afraid. They had this fear that's called androphobia. And despite their fear, they were still afraid. But they kept doing the job anyway. And I just think that's an important lesson for us as Christians. Sometimes as Christians, there's things that are just fearful because we happen to not only be Christians, we also happen to be people. And so we might be afraid of heights, and we really don't like when our youth pastor plays tricks on us. Or we might be afraid of spiders, or, you know what the most common fear, the most common phobia is in the world today? Glossophobia. That's fear of public speaking. That's the most common fear in the world today. Yeah, you relate? Most people relate. Now, the problem is there's others of us, and our problem is we really like public speaking, and so we just keep going on and on because we're enjoying what we're doing, and we've already, when someone comes to our church and they're a special guest, they say, well, how long do you usually go? I said, just remember to quit when you're done. Because some of us don't. We enjoy speaking, and so we just take another trip around Mount Sinai. They built despite their sin. They were given a job to do. Conditions were not great. At this point, the people who claimed that they were Jews as well, or at least partially Jews, were now their enemies. They were taking up arms and trying to kill them and stop the building. In spite of that, they built as one man. You see, unity, any place, in the family, in the government, in the world, in the church. Unity is always a choice, it's not a coincidence. It's not that, well, it just so happens that when I married Roberta, the two of us were compatible. And so we've been able to stick it out for 44, 5. She's been married 45 years. I think I have too. I think we got married at the same time. 45 years. It's not because just by coincidence, we have always thought the same. That's not why we're together today. Or any of you that are with a spouse for a long time. It's not because you just happen to agree on everything. Now, we did come up with a good plan. When we got married, we said that because I'm the head of the home, I'll look after all the major decisions, and Roberta can look after all the minor decisions. And in 45 years, we've never had a major decision. But the reason that marriages work is because they choose to make it work, not because by coincidence they happen to be compatible. They think the same. They never have any problems. They choose to work together. That's the same in the church. If we're going to be united in the church, if we're going to work together as the Christian community in Drayton Valley, then we have to choose to not make the Baptist church the enemy because 3 of our people are now going there. That's a choice we make. They chose to be united. They worked, they built as one man. Secondly, they built despite the fact that they were afraid. They didn't overcome their fear. They didn't ignore their fear. They didn't deny their fear. They were afraid, but they kept doing what they knew God had called them to do. And there are times in life when you know what to do, and the truth of the matter is, you're afraid. You don't know the outcome, but you just know that this is what I need to do. Don't let your fears immobilize you, because doing nothing is also a choice. They built despite of yours. And then lastly, they built the altar first. I think that's very, very important. We need to recognize that God is more interested in our heart than our hands. God didn't call us to be part of the church so he could get his edifice built. I think there's a lot of things in the church that we place a higher priority on than God does. And I think there's some things in the church that God places a higher priority on than we do. We need to be sure that the first thing we offer to God is ourselves. Build the altar in your life. It doesn't matter. Yesterday I happened to go, I had the privilege of going skiing. I guess it was the day before. Skiing with the pastor of a church that has 3 campuses. The main campus every weekend has 2,300 people attend that particular church. That, by the way, is quite a bit bigger than my church. And he was telling me about some of the frustrations he's had with people who get to be big, and they're the only people that focus on that. I'm big. He told me about some issues where some speakers who apparently have gained lots of fame because this speaker honors this speaker, and this speaker honors this speaker, and this speaker says, you come to my church, and I'll give you, I kid you not, this is it, $60,000 to $70,000 honorarium. But it's mutual. You're also going to invite me to your church, and you're going to give. So all these poor people in the church who are doing their best to help build what they believe is the kingdom of God are giving sacrificially, and God will honor that because they're doing right. But they think it's all going into building the kingdom, and now this guy's, he's one of the he's pastors one of the two largest churches that I know of in Edmonton. So he's in that circle. That's all I'm saying. He knows what's going on. He says, we've got to be focusing on churches. So right now, these two campuses. He's taken two smaller churches, about this size, and they took a church in Wainwright, and he's dumped, I think, $600,000 into fixing up the church. For a church, wouldn't it be nice if he came to this church and said, hey, here's $600,000. We could really spruce up the look of this building and the programs you can do, and we'll give you a whole bunch of people to help you do it, and we'll cover your costs. Out of the church that he could say, can you raise my salary? But instead he'd say, our goal is to reach people. The best way to do that is to start churches. Jesus said that it would be his church that he would build, and the gates, not the kingdom of one particular well-known preacher. I just recognize him. The reason I love him is because I just sense in him his first focus is the altar in his life. I want to stay close to God. I want to stay humble. I want to be listening. God, what do you want me to do with what you've given me? And God's given him some pretty big influence. So what does God want you to do? His name happens to be Mike. Mike, what does God want you to do? And he turns around and he looks at me and he's, well, what about you? What's God called you to do? And I turn around and I say to you, what has God called you to do? I want you to know that he's more interested in you than what he's called you to do. Let's be a church that chooses to work as one man, that chooses to build even though there's some unknown fears, that chooses to keep the altar central. And that's the church that God is blessing. Thank you.